Clara Whitmore did not cry when the stagecoach driver dropped her bag in the mud and drove away without looking back. She did not cry when the women on the boardwalk covered their mouths and laughed. She picked up that bag herself, both hands full weight, muddy hem dragging, and she walked straight toward the broken gate of the most ruined ranch in Willow Creek, Montana, with her chin level and her jaw set like iron. She had been rejected by the whole world. She was not about to reject herself. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end, and drop your city in the comments below, so I can see exactly how far this story has traveled. The summer of 1884 arrived in Willow Creek, Montana territory. The way trouble always arrived in small towns quietly without warning, wearing the face of something ordinary. The stagecoach from Billings pulled in just past noon on a Thursday, trailing a thick curtain of road dust that settled over the boardwalk and coated the boots of every man and woman who had gathered to watch. It was not unusual for people to gather at the stage stop. In a town this size, strangers were entertainment. But the woman who stepped off that coach was not the kind of stranger anyone had expected. Clara Whitmore came down the iron steps slowly, carefully, one hand gripping the side rail because the step was narrow and her body was not. She was 26 years old, dark chestnut hair pinned loosely at the back of her neck with a face that could have stopped a man in his tracks. Wide brown eyes, full mouth, skin still bright despite months of hard travel. She was beautiful in the way that some women are beautiful without knowing it, without performing it, without asking anyone's permission to be. But she was also large. Generously, undeniably, unmistakably large. Her blue prairie dress strained at the shoulders and gathered wide at the hips, and when her boot hit the Montana soil and the wooden step groaned under her weight, every person standing on that boardwalk heard it. The laughter started before the dust had settled. It was not the loud, honest laughter of people caught off guard. It was the quiet, deliberate kind, the laughter of people who wanted to make sure the target heard them. Women leaned toward each other behind gloved hands. A group of men near the feed store exchanged slow grins. A boy of about 12 pointed openly until his mother pulled his arm down, though she did not stop smiling herself. Clara heard all of it. She reached back into the coach and retrieved her suitcase, one battered brown leather case with a broken brass latch, held closed by a length of rope, and she set it down in the mud beside her feet without flinching. A woman in a yellow dress standing near the post office spoke just loudly enough to carry. "Lord Almighty," she answered Callahan's advertisement. "That poor man must be out of his mind." Her companion pressed a handkerchief to her lips. Well, what did anyone expect? What decent woman would go out there? The ranch is half dead, and so is he. She doesn't look like she'd last a week. She doesn't look like she could climb into a saddle without killing the horse. More laughter. Polished, practiced, mean as a winter blade. Clara picked up her suitcase and turned away from all of it. She had been hearing versions of these words her entire life. They had worn grooves in her, like a river-cut stone, not breaking her, but shaping her into something harder and more permanent than the people doing the cutting ever understood. She looked down the main road of Willow Creek, past the general store, and the barber, and the small white church at the edge of town, toward the low hills. In the distance where, according to the letter she had memorized, and then burned, so she would not lose it. The Callahan homestead sat at the end of a dirt road lined with cottonwood trees. She started walking. "Miss," the voice came from her left, low-controlled, carrying just enough weight to make her stop without commanding her to. She turned. The man standing at the edge of the boardwalk was not what she had imagined from his advertisement. She had pictured someone older, defeated, maybe broken in the visible way, stooped shoulders, empty eyes, the look of a man who had already written himself off. Ethan Callahan was none of those things. He was tall, genuinely tall, the kind of tall that made you aware of the space he occupied. Broad through the chest and shoulders, lean through the middle, with the particular physical economy of a man who had worked hard land for so many years that his body had stopped carrying anything it didn't need. His hair was dark brown and slightly too long, curling at the collar of his worn flannel shirt. His eyes beneath the shadow of a battered hat were the pale, serious blue of an overcast sky. Howe was without question the best-looking man Clara had seen in 3 states. He was also looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. Not the amusement of the crowd. Not pity exactly, but something more careful than either. Like a man assessing a situation before deciding how to respond to it. He stepped down off the boardwalk and picked up her suitcase before she could object. "You're Miss Whitmore," he said. It was not a question. "I am," she said. "Ethan Callahan." He did not offer his hand. He just stood there with her suitcase and studied her for a moment with those pale eyes. "My wagon's around the side of the mercantile. It's about 40 minutes out to the ranch." I know, she said. "I read your letter 3 times. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the suggestion that one was possible. "Then let's go," he said. He turned and walked. She followed. Behind them. The woman in the yellow dress said something Clara did not catch. Whatever it was, it earned a round of laughter that followed them all the way to the corner of the building. Ethan did not acknowledge it. Clara kept her eyes forward. Neither of them spoke until they reached the wagon. The road to the Callahan homestead was exactly as the letter had described, long, dry, and lined with cottonwood trees that rattled and sighed in the July wind. The wagon seat was narrow enough that their arms nearly touched, and Ethan kept both hands on the reins and his eyes on the road, and said nothing for the first 10 minutes of the drive. Clara was not a woman who filled silence out of discomfort. She had grown up in a house where silence was safer than conversation, where saying the wrong thing in front of the wrong person cost more than she could pay. She had learned to read silence the way some people read books, for what they contained, for what they were protecting. This silence was not hostile. It was habitual. The silence of a man who had stopped expecting conversation and no longer knew how to invite it. She looked out at the land on either side of the road. She was from Ohio. She had grown up with flat farmland, modest creeks, modest ambitions. She had never seen country like this, enormous and indifferent, rolling away in every direction with a scale that made the human body feel approximately the size of a sentence in the middle of a very long book. She was also looking at the fences, or rather, at what was left of them. 3 separate sections along the road were down or leaning at angles that would have embarrassed any rancher worth the name. The posts were rotted at the base. The wire was slack or broken. In 2 places, she could see where cattle had pushed through, and the gaps had been repaired with whatever was available, rope, scrap wood, a length of chain that made no structural sense. She said nothing yet. She was gathering information. After 20 minutes, the cottonwoods thinned, and the homestead came into view. The house was 2 stories built from timber that had weathered to a dark silver gray. It had good bones, she could see that immediately. Solid foundation, wide front porch, good roof pitch. But the porch rail had collapsed on the right side and been propped back up with a fence post. 2 of the upstairs windows were covered with boards instead of glass. The kitchen garden on the south side of the house was a tangle of unpruned growth and bare ground where things had given up or been given up on. The barn was large, and once might have been impressive. Now one side wall leaned at a noticeable angle, and the main doors hung crooked on their hinges. From inside came the sound of cattle. Not the settled, comfortable sound of well-fed animals, but the restless shifting of animals that weren't quite content. There was also a bunkhouse, small and dark, with no lamplight showing. And a chicken yard, with far fewer chickens in it than the structure had been built to hold. Clara took all of this in without expression. Ethan brought the wagon to a stop in front of the house and climbed down. He came around to her side. She noticed he did it automatically without flourish. Just a man who had been raised with certain habits and held up a hand. She took it and stepped down. He carried her suitcase to the front door and pushed it open. It was unlocked. She filed that away too. Inside the house was clean in the way that a bachelor's house is clean, which is to say, the things that were visible were orderly, and the things that weren't visible hadn't been dealt with in some time. The front room had a stone fireplace, a wooden table with 4 chairs, a braided rug that had seen better decades. A shelf of books on the back wall which surprised her. A rifle above the mantel which did not. He set her suitcase at the foot of the stairs. "Your room is the first one on the right," he said. "There's a wash basin. Water pumps around the back of the house. I'll have supper on in an hour." "You cook?" she asked. "I eat," he said. "Whether it qualifies as cooking is a matter of debate." She looked at him. He looked at her. That almost smile again there and then, not there, like a cloud crossing the sun. "I'll cook," she said. He nodded once, as if that settled something. He picked up his hat from a hook by the door and put it back on. "I'll be in the barn if you need anything." He went out. Clara stood in the middle of the front room and breathed. She had made it. She had crossed 4 states on 3 different coaches with a broken suitcase and $32 and a letter she'd memorized and burned, and she had made it. She was standing in a house that was ugly and worn and imperfect, and hers for as long as she could make herself useful enough to stay. She was not going to waste a single day. She went to find the kitchen. Supper that evening was salt pork cornbread she made from the tin of meal she found in the pantry and canned peaches heated in their syrup. It was not elaborate, but it was edible, which was apparently an improvement. Ethan sat across the table from her and ate steadily and in silence for the first few minutes. Then he looked up. "How long were you on the road?" 9 days, she said. "From Ohio." "From Columbus." He nodded. "Cut another piece of cornbread." "You had people there." "I had a room," she said. "The people were gone." He did not ask for more than that. She appreciated it. "The advertisement said you needed help managing the property," she said. "How long has it been this way?" He looked up. "What way?" "The fences on the South Road are down in 3 places. The barn door hinges are failing. The garden's been abandoned since at least last spring, maybe longer. One of the bunkhouse windows is cracked and stuffed with cloth to keep the cold out." She kept her voice level, matter of fact, the same tone she might use to read a grocery list. "I'm not criticizing. I'm asking how long." Ethan set his fork down. He looked at her with an expression that was harder to read than the almost smile, not offended, not defensive, but genuinely caught off guard. As if she had said something in a language he hadn't expected her to speak. 3 years, he said finally. Maybe 4. After my father died, I was running the place alone. I got behind. Getting behind out here is easier than it sounds. "I know it is," she said. "Do you?" "I grew up on a farm," she said. "Not like this, smaller, but I know what it looks like when the weight gets ahead of the hands." He picked his fork back up, looked at his plate. "The bank's been patient," he said in the tone of a man admitting something he'd rather not. "But patience runs out. When's the note due?" He looked up again. This time, there was something new in his expression, a wariness, but underneath it, something almost like relief. The relief of a man who had been carrying a heavy thing alone for long enough that the offer of another pair of hands, even from an unexpected source, was almost too much to accept gracefully. "End of October," he said. It was July. Clara did the arithmetic in her head, the same way she had been doing arithmetic her whole life, quietly, practically without drama. "That's enough time," she said. "Enough time for what?" "To do something about it." She looked at him steadily. "If we start tomorrow." Ethan Callahan looked at this woman, this large, plain-dressed, unasked-for woman who had arrived from nowhere with a broken suitcase and proceeded within 3 hours to diagnose everything wrong with his ranch and tell him there was still time to fix it, and he did not know what to say. He said the only thing he had. "All right," he said. "Tomorrow." She woke before dawn. Not because she had set herself to wake, she never needed to. Her body had learned years ago that the best hours, the only hours that were entirely her own, existed in the dark before the rest of the world remembered to have opinions about her. She dressed quickly, wound her hair back, and went downstairs. She started the stove, made coffee strong enough to hold its shape, found a pencil stub in the kitchen drawer and a piece of wrapping paper from the pantry shelf, and began writing. By the time Ethan came downstairs, she had a list. He stopped in the kitchen doorway, looked at her at the table, looked at the coffee, looked at the piece of wrapping paper covered in neat, closely spaced handwriting. "You've been up a while," he said. "Coffee's ready," she said. "Sit down." He sat. She pushed the list across the table. He picked it up. Read it. It was thorough. Fence repairs by priority. Which sections first? Why, what materials would be needed? Approximate time to complete each. Water trough inspection and repair schedule. The garden, which crops could still be planted this late in the season and which ones couldn't. Barn door repair. Inventory of existing cattle feed versus what would be needed through winter and what the shortfall would cost. At the bottom, in smaller writing. Talk to Hendricks at the feed store before Friday. Find out what Pearson's sold his last cattle lot for. Pull your father's breeding records if you have them. There may be value you're not seeing. Ethan read it twice. He set it down carefully, the way you set down something you don't want to crumple. You wrote this morning, he said. I wrote what I was already thinking, she said. Writing just keeps it organized. How do you know about cattle breeding records? I read, she said. A lot. When you're the kind of person most people don't want to talk to, books are good company. He was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee mug in his hands. Miss Whitmore, he said. Clara, she said. If we're going to work together, Miss Whitmore is going to get exhausting. Clara. He said it once as if testing the weight of it. The banknote, the repairs, the cattle. That's a lot to take on. I know it is. You came here to help manage the house. That's what the advertisement said. The advertisement said you needed help, she said. It didn't specify which parts. He looked at her. The kitchen was filling slowly with the gray pre-dawn light, and in it, his eyes were a color she couldn't quite name. Not gray, not exactly blue. Something in between that shifted, depending on where she looked. Why? He asked. The question was quiet, but it had depth to it. Real depth. He wasn't asking why she wanted to help with the fence repairs. I was asking something older and heavier than that. Clara wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. Because I need this to work, she said. I have $32 and nowhere to go back to. And because... She stopped, started again. Because I have spent my whole life watching people look at me and decide I'm not worth their time before I've opened my mouth. I am done letting that be the last word. Silence. The stove ticked. The coffee steamed. That's honest, Ethan said. I don't have the luxury of being otherwise, she said. He nodded slowly, picked up his hat from the table, stood. After breakfast, he said, show me the fence priority list. She looked up at him. He was standing in the kitchen doorway again, hat in hand, and the morning light was just beginning to come through the window behind him. You'll listen, she said. I'll listen, he said. I won't promise to agree with everything, but I'll listen. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise of anything large or romantic or transformative. It was just a man tired and stubborn and carrying too much weight alone, deciding to stop carrying it quite so alone for one morning. But for Clara Whitmore, who had spent 26 years being told that her words were not worth hearing, it was the most significant thing anyone had said to her in years. She stood up and began making breakfast. Word traveled. The way, it always traveled in small towns, faster than any horse could carry. It carried by nothing more substantial than air, and the human need to have something to say. By the following Sunday, everyone in Willow Creek had a version of the story. The version that traveled fastest was Margaret Hale's, because Margaret Hale had seen Clara Whitmore on her first day, and had been the first person to say the thing everyone else was thinking. Margaret told the story at church, at the dry goods store, at the weekly gathering of the Willow Creek Ladies Auxiliary, and at her own kitchen table to anyone who came by for coffee. The story in Margaret's telling went like this. The desperate rancher had sent for a woman sight unseen, and what arrived was a disaster. A large, ungainly, unmarriageable woman from Ohio, who had apparently already made a nuisance of herself by. And this was the part Margaret delivered with particular relish, telling Ethan Callahan what was wrong with his own ranch. Can you imagine? Margaret said to whoever was listening. She hasn't been there 24 hours, and she's already acting like she owns the place. That man is going to regret the day he answered that letter. Reverend Cole's wife, a quiet woman named Alma, who was generally considered one of the more sensible people in Willow Creek, asked what Callahan himself had said about it. Margaret paused. Well, I haven't spoken to him directly. Has anyone? A silence. Because no one had spoken to Ethan Callahan directly about anything in quite some time. He came to town when he needed supplies. He did not stay to talk. He did not attend church. He settled his accounts at the mercantile without looking at anyone, and he drove back out to his ranch, and the town had long since decided this was simply who he was. The closed-off, half-failed rancher at the end of the Cottonwood Road. A man who had let his father's good property go to ruin through stubbornness and bad luck, and whatever private grief he would not speak about. But Alma Cole said quietly, "It seems to me that if the man needed help and found it, the details of her figure are not particularly our concern." Margaret Hale gave her a look that could have curdled fresh milk. The story kept traveling. On Wednesday of the following week, Clara was in the feed store when Harold Pierce walked in. She had seen Pierce twice before, once on the main street the day she arrived, once at the mercantile. Both times he had looked at her with the particular expression of a man taking inventory of something he considers a potential liability. How was in his mid-50s, heavy through the middle, with the smooth hands and careful clothes of a man who had never done physical work, but understood very well how to profit from other people doing it. He had small eyes behind small spectacles, and when he smiled, which he did now upon seeing her, it did not reach anywhere near those eyes. "Miss Whitmore," he said pleasantly. "Shopping for Callahan?" "Yes," she said. "How are things out at the ranch?" He leaned against the counter with the casual ease of a man who owns his comfort in every room he enters. "I imagine it's quite a project getting that place in order." "It's coming along," she said. "I'm sure it is." He nodded, slow and sympathetic, the nod of a man performing concern for someone else's difficulty. "It's a fine piece of land, you know. I've always thought so. It's a shame what's happened to it." "What has happened to it," Clara said, "is that it needs work. Work can be done." Pierce studied her for a moment. The pleasant expression stayed in place, but something shifted beneath it, a slight recalibration, the way a man adjusts his grip when a tool turns out to be heavier than expected. "You seem confident," he said. "I am," she said. "Well," he smiled again, "I hope Ethan appreciates having someone so dedicated out there." He let the pause do its work. "He's always been a man who needs more help than he's willing to ask for. I'd hate to see that property end up in the wrong hands after everything his father built." He said it gently, sorrowfully, the way you say something you intend as a warning while maintaining total deniability that it was ever a threat. Clara looked at him directly. She had spent enough years among people who used soft words as hard weapons to know exactly what was happening. "Mr. Pierce," she said, "Ethan Callahan is going to be fine." She took her package from the counter clerk and walked out. Behind her she heard Pierce make a small sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a dismissal. Something in between. The sound of a man who has decided something isn't a threat yet. She did not let him see that her hands were shaking slightly by the time she reached the wagon. That evening, she sat across from Ethan at the kitchen table with his father's breeding records spread between them. 3 old ledgers, cracked spines, pages soft with age, and she told him what she had found. "Your father wasn't just running cattle," she said. "He was developing a bloodline. Look." She turned a ledger toward him and pointed. "This line here. He was crossing the Hereford stock with imported Durham cattle. That's not common, and it wasn't cheap. He spent years on this." Ethan looked at the page. Something moved across his face, a complicated expression she was learning to read, the one that appeared whenever his father came up. "He never told me that's what he was doing," he said. "He said he was just improving the stock. How was doing more than improving it? If he kept the lines consistent." She opened the second ledger. "He did. Look at these notes. He was documenting everything. Ethan, these records could be worth more than you know. Selective breeding records like this ranches have paid serious money for bloodlines with this kind of documentation." Ethan was quiet, looking at the pages. Clara watched him. "Why didn't he ever say?" he asked. He wasn't asking her. He was asking the room, asking the ceiling, asking the old version of a conversation that would never happen now. Maybe he thought there'd be more time, she said. People always think there'll be more time. He closed the ledger carefully, set it to the side. What do we do with it? He said. We start by making sure the cattle you have are healthy enough to demonstrate what the bloodline can do. Then we get the word out carefully to the right people that you're sitting on something valuable. She paused. But first the fence. Healthy cattle mean nothing if they walk off your land. He looked at her across the table. In the lamplight, his face was all plains and shadow, and he had that expression again, the one she couldn't entirely name. Not the almost smile. Something quieter than that. You came here to help with the household, he said. I helped with supper, she said. We have until October. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You know what people in town are saying? I've heard some of it, she said. They think you're a mistake. They've thought that about me before, she said. She said it plainly without self-pity and without performance, just as a fact about the landscape of her life that she had long since made her peace with. Ethan looked at her. Their opinion of you is wrong, he said. It was 4 words. A short sentence simply stated no particular drama in the delivery. Not a declaration, not a speech. Just a man saying a true thing the way he would say that a fence post needed replacing or that the weather was turning. Clara felt those 4 words land somewhere in the center of her chest and stay there. Thank you, she said. Equally simple. He nodded, stood. Early start tomorrow, he said. South fence first. I'll have coffee ready, she said. I took the lamp from the table and went upstairs. Clara sat alone in the kitchen for a long moment, the breeding ledgers open in front of her, the darkness pressing soft against the windows. She had not expected gratitude. She had come here for survival, for purpose, for a place that needed what she had to offer badly enough that it would not send her away. She had not come here expecting anyone to see her. But Ethan Callahan had looked at her across a table covered in old ledgers and said 4 words, and something in Clara Whitmore that had been shut for a very long time, opened just a fraction, like a window cracked in a closed room. She closed the ledgers, stood up, washed the coffee mugs. Tomorrow, the south fence. There was always so much work to do. She found for the first time in years that she was glad of it. The south fence took 4 days. Not because it was 4 days of work, but because on the second day, the sky opened up and dropped 3 inches of rain on the Montana territory in the span of 6 hours, turning the ground to mud that sucked at boots and made every step a negotiation. Clara worked through the first 2 hours of it before Ethan appeared at her shoulder and said flatly, "Stop." She kept hammering the post. "Clara." "It still needs to go in," she said. "The ground's too soft. You'll drive it in today, and it'll lean by morning." She stopped, looked at the post, looked at the ground. He was right, and she knew he was right, and she hated knowing it because stopping felt like losing. "Inside," he said. "There's other work." There was always other work. That was the thing about a place this far gone. You could not run out of things to do. You could only run out of daylight and energy. And Clara had made a private agreement with herself to outlast both as long as possible. She followed him inside. He handed her a towel without comment. She was soaked through to the skin, her hair plastered flat, her blue dress the only sturdy one she'd brought dark with rain and mud at the hem. She dried her face, looked at him. "You're soaked too," she said. "I've been wet before," he said. "So have I." He almost smiled. Almost. They spent the afternoon at the kitchen table with the breeding ledgers and a territorial survey map that Ethan dug out from the bottom of a trunk in his father's old study. He spread it flat and held down the corners with coffee mugs, and they bent over it together, closer than they'd been before, close enough that she could hear him breathe, and argued respectfully but firmly about which parcels of the grazing land were being underused and why. "This section here," Clara said, pointing, "it's not on your current rotation. It's dry most summers. It wasn't dry last summer. Your neighbor Pearson ran 30 head on a section half this size." Ethan looked at her. "How do you know what Pearson ran?" "I asked his hired man at the feed store." A pause. "You asked Pearson's hired man?" "Tom, he's friendly. He talks." She kept her finger on the map. The point is, the land can carry more than you're using it for. Ethan looked at the map, then at her, then back at the map. He had a way of going quiet that was not the silence of a man with nothing to say, but the silence of a man who was actually thinking, who was turning something over and examining all its sides before he responded. She had come to prefer it to men who answered fast and wrong. "You're right," he said. She looked up. "About the section," he said, as if clarifying, which she had not asked him to do. "We'll add it to the rotation when the weather breaks." "All right," she said. Outside, the rain continued to come down. Inside, the ledgers spread between them. They kept working. The weather broke on Friday. By Saturday morning, Clara was back at the fence line with a post driver and a level, and Ethan working the other end of the section, and by Sunday afternoon, the south fence was solid for the first time in 3 years. Ethan stood at the end of it and looked along the line of new posts. "It's straight," he said. "I used a level," she said. "I see that." He turned to look at her. She was dirty and tired, and her hair had come half down from its pin, and she had a bruise developing along her left forearm where the post driver had slipped on Thursday and caught her before she could pull back. She had not mentioned it. He had seen it anyway. "Your arm," he said. "It's fine." "Let me see." "Ethan." "Clara." He said her name the same way she said his, levelly, without heat, but with enough gravity to make her stop arguing. She held out her arm. He took her wrist in one hand and turned it to look at the bruise, and his hands were careful in a way she had not expected from a man his size, the hands of someone who understood that some things required less force, not more. "It should be wrapped," he said. "I'll wrap it tonight. I have bandage cloth in the barn." "After supper," she said. He released her arm, stepped back, looked at the fence again. "My father built the original line," he said, 30 years ago. He used to say a good fence is an act of faith. You're betting the future on something you can't see yet." She looked at the fence, then at him. "He sounds like he was a thoughtful man." He was. A beat. "He would have liked you." The words landed quietly. Clara looked away at the pasture. She was not accustomed to people saying things like that to her, things that assumed her worth, assumed her value, before she'd had to prove it 3 separate times to earn the assumption. "That's a kind thing to say," she said. "It's a true thing," he said. The same tone he'd used before, just a fact among facts. They walked back toward the house. The next 3 weeks moved. The way. Hard work always moves faster than you expect when you're in it, slower than you can believe when you look back. Clara rose before dawn every day. She went to bed after dark every night. In between, she did not stop. She reorganized the supply pantry and found 6 months of waste in poor storage feed, going bad, staples left open to moisture things, doubled up and forgotten in the back of shelves. She fixed it. She replanted the kitchen garden with what the season would still support: turnips, late carrots, winter squash, and spent 2 evenings mending the chicken yard fence so the remaining hens stopped wandering into the road. She went through every room in the house and cataloged what needed immediate repair versus what could wait, and she told Ethan directly every time exactly what she had found and what she thought should be done about it. He listened. He didn't always agree, but he listened, and when she was right, which was most of the time, he said so, and when she had missed something, he told her that too, and gradually, without either of them naming what was happening, they developed a working rhythm, a shorthand. The particular economy of 2 people who have figured out how to be in the same space productively, where a look communicates what would take 3 sentences, where the division of tasks happens naturally, because each person knows what the other is better at. It was not romance. It was something quieter, and in some ways more durable, the beginning of genuine respect. The cattle were Ethan's territory, and she watched him with them without inserting herself, learning what she could from a distance. He was different with the animals than he was with people, more open, more patient, moving among them with a ease that was the closest thing to relaxed she had seen on him. The herd was small, but the animals were good quality, and when she started reviewing the breeding ledgers in the evenings, she began to see what his father had actually built over 20 years of careful, patient selection. She brought it up at a supper one Thursday. set the ledger open beside his plate. "Your bull," she said. "Samson. He's the third-generation product of your father's original cross." Ethan looked at the page. "I know. Do you know that there's a breeder in Helena who has been trying to produce exactly this phenotype for 6 years?" He looked up. "I wrote to him 2 weeks ago," she said. "I described the bloodline." He wrote back. Ethan set down his fork. Slowly. "You wrote to a breeder in Helena." "I found his name in your father's correspondence file. There were letters between them from the late 70s. He remembered your father." Silence. "Clara," he said. "He wants to come see the herd," she said. "I said I'd have to ask you, so I'm asking." Ethan looked at the letter she slid across the table, a single-page formal handwriting, the name James Whitfield of the Whitfield Cattle Company, Helena. He read it again. "This is real," he said. "I don't write fictional letters," she said. He looked up at her, and this time the almost smile became an actual one. Brief, unguarded, the real thing for just a moment before he pulled it back. "When?" He suggested the first week of September. "That gives us 6 weeks. 6 weeks to get the herd in condition to impress a serious buyer. Or serious investor," she said. He mentioned partnership in the letter, which is better for you long-term than a single sale. Ethan folded the letter carefully. Set it down. He was quiet for a long moment, and she recognized the quality of the quiet. He was not retreating, he was processing. There was a difference. "You did this without telling me," he said. "I found the connection, and I followed it," she said. "I told you as soon as there was something concrete to tell. If that was wrong, tell me and I won't do it again." Another quiet. Longer this time. She held the silence and did not fill it. "It wasn't wrong," he said. "I just wasn't." He stopped. Tried again. "Nobody's taken initiative on this ranch in a long time. I forgot what it felt like." "How does it feel?" she asked. He looked at her across the table. The lamp was between them, low and warm, and in its light his eyes were darker than usual. "Strange," he said, "but not bad." But Willow Creek was not done with them yet. The following Tuesday, Clara drove the wagon into town for the week's supplies. She went to the mercantile first, then the feed store, then stopped at the post office for Ethan's mail. It was on the way out of the post office that she ran into Virginia Marsh. Virginia Marsh was 24 years old, the daughter of the town's most successful merchant, and the kind of beautiful that other women noticed first. Golden-haired, slim, with the precise, deliberate prettiness of a woman who understood its value and managed it carefully. She had grown up in Willow Creek, knowing that things would be handed to her, and they had been, and she had never seen any reason for this to stop. She had also. Clara had gathered from various conversations at the feed store, been pursuing Ethan Callahan with strategic patience for the better part of 2 years. "Miss Whitmore," Virginia said with a smile warm as February. "I was hoping to run into you." "Miss Marsh," Clara said. "I just wanted to say." Virginia tilted her head slightly, the movement of a woman performing warmth. "I think it's so admirable what you're doing out there, taking care of the house for poor Ethan. He's been struggling so long. It must be such a comfort to him having someone to cook and clean." Clara looked at her. "I manage the property," she said. "Cooking is one part of it." "Of course." Virginia nodded, not registering the correction or choosing not to. Some of us in town have been a little worried about him, about the situation. It's such an unusual arrangement." She lowered her voice conspiratorially, as if they were sharing a confidence. "People talk, you know. I'd hate for anything to damage his reputation further. He's had such a hard time." "His reputation," Clara said, "is improving along with his fences and his cattle operation. I wouldn't worry about it." Virginia's smile held. Her eyes did not. "Well," she said, "you certainly are confident. I suppose that's useful in a housekeeper." "Good day, Miss Marsh," Clara said. She walked to the wagon and climbed in and drove out of town at a steady pace, looking straight ahead. By the time she reached the Cottonwood Road, her jaw had unclenched. She had known from the first day that this was the shape of things. She had known it and accepted it, and she was not going to let a woman with gold hair and a strategic smile shake anything that had taken her 6 weeks of pre-dawn mornings to build. She was not a housekeeper. She was the woman keeping this ranch alive. And the difference mattered. She did not tell Ethan about Virginia Marsh, but she told him about Harold Pierce, because Pierce came to the ranch. It happened on a Wednesday mid-afternoon while Ethan was in the far pasture checking on a cow that had been off her feed. Clara was in the yard splitting wood. She had taken it up 2 weeks ago, when it became clear the woodpile was going to be critically short before November, when the horse and rider came up the Cottonwood Road. She knew who it was before he was close enough to speak. She kept splitting wood. Pierce dismounted at the fence and leaned on the gatepost with his hands folded, watching her work. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Quite the industrious scene." "Mr. Pierce." She set another log on the block, split it, set the halves aside. "Ethan's in the back pasture. I can send someone for him." "I actually came to speak with you," he said pleasantly. She set down the splitting axe, turned to face him fully. She had not forgotten the conversation at the feed store. She had been waiting with the patience of a woman who has been managing difficult men her whole life for the next move. "Oh," she said. "I've been hearing interesting things," Pierce said. "About letters to Helena, about a cattle buyer coming to look at the herd." The information had traveled fast, faster than it should have. She filed that away. "Ranchers talk to buyers," she said. "That's not unusual." "It's not," he agreed. "What's unusual is," he smiled, "the source of the initiative. Some people find it a little surprising that the management decisions for a property of this size are being driven by a woman who arrived 2 months ago with no established history in this territory." "My history," Clara said, "is in what I've done since I arrived." He nodded, as if she'd made a charming but irrelevant point. "The thing is, Miss Whitmore Callahan's note comes due in October. And right now, based on current cattle values and the condition of the property, I'm not certain the ranch can meet it." A pause. His eyes behind the small spectacles were flat and careful. "I've made Ethan a fair offer on the land before. He turned it down. But circumstances change." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "What kind of offer?" she said. "A generous one, given the condition the property was in." "Was in," she said. "You'd want to update your assessment." Something moved in his expression. Barely perceptible. A slight tightening. "You're very sure of yourself," he said. "I'm sure of this ranch," she said. "There's a difference." Pierce was quiet for a moment. He looked at the freshly split woodpile, at the mended yard fence, at the garden which had come up remarkably well for a late planting, at the barn where the doors now hung straight on their new hinges. She watched him notice all of it. She watched him recalculate. "Callahan is lucky to have such a dedicated," he paused, "employee. He's lucky to have a good ranch," she said. "I'm just helping him remember that." Pierce touched the brim of his hat, remounted his horse, looked down at her from his height with the expression of a man who has not been outmaneuvered often and is still deciding whether that's what just happened. "Give Callahan my regards," he said. He rode away down the Cottonwood Road. Clara stood in the yard watching him go, and the steadiness she had projected, which was real, it was always real. She did not perform calm. She was calm, cost her something. She could feel it. The effort of standing straight in front of a man like that, of not letting him see any of the places where she was vulnerable, of holding her ground. Not because she felt unassailable, but because she had decided long ago that feeling assailable was not the same as being it. She picked up the splitting axe and went back to work. She had told Ethan she could do this. She was not going to be wrong. He found out about Pierce's visit at supper. She told him directly. She always told him directly. She had no patience for the social habit of softening information until it lost its shape. Ethan's expression went through several changes in the span of about 10 seconds. Something that was almost anger. Something underneath it that was closer to worry. Then the particular stillness that arrived when he was deciding how to respond to a thing. "He came to the ranch," Ethan said. "Yes." "And spoke to you." "Yes." "Without—" He stopped himself, started again more quietly. He should have spoken to me. He wanted to speak to me, Clara said. I think he wanted to see whether I could be unsettled. And I wasn't. Ethan looked at her. What did he say about the note? She told him. All of it. She watched his jaw tighten, and his hands still on the table, and she understood that she was watching a man deal with the particular shame of someone else, knowing the full weight of a problem he had been trying to manage privately. Ethan, she said, look at me. He looked at her. Pierce is going to keep moving because he thinks you're running out of time. But Whitfield is coming in 3 weeks. If that meeting goes the way I think it will, the banknote is the smallest of your problems. And if it doesn't, she met his eyes. Then we find another way. But I don't think it won't go well. I've done the numbers 6 different ways, and the breeding records are solid. Your father built something real here. A silence. Ethan looked at the table, then back at her. Why are you doing this? He said. It was the same question he had asked in the kitchen that first morning. But it was a different question now, not the question of a man wondering about a stranger's motives. The question of a man who was starting to understand the answer and was still somehow surprised by it. Because this ranch deserves to survive, she said. And because she stopped. She was not a woman who said unguarded things. She measured words the way she measured feed, precisely without waste. But something in the quality of his looking at her made precision harder to maintain than usual. Because I've spent my whole life being somewhere I wasn't wanted, she said. This is the first place where the work I do actually matters. I'm not going to let Pierce or anyone else take that. Ethan did not say anything for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and picked up his coffee mug and said, 3 weeks to get the herd in the best shape we've ever had them. 3 weeks? She agreed. We'll need to pull the breeding records into a proper presentation, something Whitfield can take back to Helena. Already started, she said. He looked at her. Of course you have. I work better when I'm ahead, she said. I'm starting to understand that, he said. And for the first time in as long as either of them could have said something in the air at that kitchen table was not just the weight of problems and work and time running short. It was something lighter than that, something that had not quite found its name yet. Neither of them reached for the name, but neither of them looked away. The next 2 weeks were the hardest yet and the best yet, both at once. The cattle work intensified. Ethan was in the pastures from sunup, and Clara managed the ranch logistics, the feed calculations, the supply runs, the letters back and forth to Whitfield and Helena, finalizing the date and the nature of the visit. She also finished the breeding record presentation, 12 pages of organized documentation that pulled together 30 years of her father-in-law's careful notes into a form that could be read and understood by a serious buyer in under an hour. She showed it to Ethan the evening she finished it. He read it at the kitchen table without speaking. She watched him turn the pages. Watched his face, the particular movement of an expression that is moving toward something it doesn't have a word for. When he finished, he set it down, and he looked at her, and what was on his face was not the almost smile, and it was not the calculating expression, and it was not the careful wariness he had carried like a second coat since the day she arrived. It was something open, unguarded. The face of a man who has been surprised in the best possible way and does not know yet how to close the surprise back up. My father spent 20 years building this, he said, and you put it on 12 pages in 2 weeks. He did the work, she said. I just organized it. Clara. He said her name differently this time. The way you say a word when you realize you've been mispronouncing it and the correct pronunciation is better. This is... He stopped. She waited. Thank you, he said. 2 words. Simple, direct, the same economy he used for everything. But the way he said them made them into something larger than their size, a whole conversation compressed into a single sentence. The way years of weather compress wood into something harder and more permanent than it started. You're welcome, she said. Outside, the Montana evening came in through the windows in long golden panels. The breeding records sat on the table between them. And Ethan Callahan, the man who had closed himself off from nearly everything, did not reach for his hat and did not go back to the barn, but stayed at the table a little longer. They talked. Not about the ranch. Not about Pierce or the banknote or Whitfield. About his father, the stories that weren't in the ledgers, the man behind the careful notations. About her life in Ohio, and about what it meant to grow up somewhere that couldn't hold the whole size of who you were. People decided what I was before I opened my mouth, she said. Every room, every town. I stopped expecting different. And then you came here, he said. And then I came here, she said. I was quiet for a moment. Then, I should have said sooner what I said about my father, that he would have liked you. He looked at her. I think I would have liked you too, if I'd met you before I learned not to expect much from people. The honesty of it, plain as a fence post, hard as good timber, caught her in the chest. I like you, she said, in case that wasn't clear. He looked at her. Something quiet moved across his face. It's getting clearer, he said. The lamp burned between them. The night deepened around the house. Neither of them moved to end the evening, and in that stillness, in that rare and unhurried space between two people who have worked hard and said true things, something that had been building without announcement arrived at its next stage. Not love yet, not named, but close, close enough, that when she finally said goodnight and went upstairs, she lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the Montana silence outside her window, which was enormous and indifferent, and somehow tonight not lonely at all. In the room below, she heard his chair scrape back from the table, heard him bank the fire, heard his boots on the stairs. A pause at the landing, then his footsteps moving away to his own room. She closed her eyes. 3 weeks to the Whitfield visit, 3 weeks to save the ranch. And something else, unnamed and patient, that was beginning to take root in the space between two people who had both been for too long entirely alone. James Whitfield arrived on a Tuesday. He came in a good coat and a better hat, with a leather satchel over one shoulder, and the careful, unhurried eyes of a man who had spent 30 years buying and selling cattle, and had learned to distrust anything that looked too good too fast. He was 60, maybe 62, with a white mustache and the kind of handshake that told you exactly who you were dealing with in the first 3 seconds. Clara was in the yard when his wagon came up the Cottonwood Road. She had been there for 20 minutes, not because she was anxious, she was not anxious, or she had decided not to be, which amounted to the same thing by this point, but because she had learned that how you were standing when someone arrived told them something before a word was spoken. She stood straight. She stood still. She let him pull up and climb down and look around at the yard, at the straight fence line, the level barn doors, the garden coming up clean along the south wall before she spoke. Mr. Whitfield, she said. I'm Clara Whitmore. We've been corresponding. He looked at her. It was the look she knew, the brief recalibration of expectation, the small internal adjustment a person makes when what they find is not what they pictured. She held it without expression and let him finish. Miss Whitmore, he said. His handshake was firm, and he didn't shorten it. The yard looks different than I expected. Different how? Better, he said simply. Ethan came out of the barn. He and Whitfield shook hands with the careful formality of men who knew of each other through long history, but had never met. And then they all went inside, and Clara served coffee and put the breeding record presentation on the table, and they got to work. Whitfield was thorough. He read every page of the presentation twice. He asked questions, precise technical questions about bloodline consistency and calving rates and feed conversion. And Clara answered most of them, because she had spent 2 weeks preparing to answer most of them, and Ethan answered the rest because he had spent his entire life on this land and knew things about these animals that could not be put in a ledger. After 2 hours, Whitfield sat back in his chair. Your father was more serious about this than anyone in Helena knew, he said to Ethan. He was a private man, Ethan said, clearly. Whitfield tapped the presentation. This documentation is exceptional. Whoever organized it. He glanced at Clara. Miss Whitmore, Ethan said, without hesitation. Whitfield looked at her with a different quality of attention than before. You have a background in breeding science. I have a background in reading and paying attention, she said. The science was all already in the ledgers. I organized it. Modesty, Whitfield said not unkindly. Well, Let me see the bull. They went to the pasture. Whitfield walked the fence line, stood and watched Samson move, asked Ethan about temperament and injury history, and the last 3 calving seasons. He didn't say much. Men like Whitfield Clara had understood that words were expensive, and you didn't spend them until you were sure of the return. Finally, he turned to Ethan. I want to talk numbers, he said. They talked numbers for 40 minutes. Clara said nothing during this part. It was not her place, and she knew it. She had put all the pieces on the table, and now it was Ethan's negotiation, Ethan's name, Ethan's land. But she listened, and what she heard was better than she had projected on even her most optimistic calculation. Whitfield was not interested in a one-time purchase. He was interested in a 5-year breeding partnership. Samson Services shared between the 2 operations, joint documentation of the bloodline revenue split on any offspring sales. The numbers he put forward would cover Ethan's banknote, with enough left to fund the repairs Clara had categorized as next priority on her list. Ethan looked at Clara once briefly while Whitfield was consulting a figure in his satchel. Just a glance. But it contained a full conversation. Is this what you expected? Is this good? Is this right? And she gave him the smallest nod, and he turned back to Whitfield and said, I think we can make that work. They shook hands over the kitchen table, after Whitfield's wagon disappeared down the Cottonwood Road. Ethan stood in the yard for a moment without speaking. Clara stood beside him. The afternoon was long and golden, and the cattle moved quietly in the pasture. We need to tell the bank, she said. Tomorrow, he said. I'll ride in tomorrow. I'll come with you. He looked at her sideways. You'll want a witness when you hand Pierce the documentation, she said. Someone who can confirm the terms of the Whitfield agreement. A pause. Then, you want to be there when I tell Pierce. I want to be useful, she said. That almost smile again. Full smile again, brief and real. Right, he said. They went inside and she made supper, and they ate it without talking much. But the silence between them that evening was a different quality than it had ever been. Not the careful silence of early weeks, not the working silence of shared tasks. Something easier than either. Something that did not require management. After the dishes were done, Ethan said, Clara. She turned from the wash basin. He was standing in the kitchen doorway, hat in hand. He looked at her the way he had looked at the fence line after they finished it, as if he was taking stock of something that turned out to be solid. What you did, he said. The letters, the records, the presentation. Today. He stopped, turned his hat over in his hands once. I couldn't have done today without you. You could have, she said. It would have taken longer. That's not what I mean. She looked at him. He looked at her. I know what you mean, she said quietly. You're welcome, Ethan. He nodded, put his hat back on, went out to check the animals one last time before dark. Clara stood in the kitchen and pressed one hand flat against the wash basin and breathed. 3 days later, the storm came. It arrived without proper warning, or rather, with the kind of warning that the territory gave, which was enough for people who had grown up reading the sky, and nothing at all for people who hadn't. The morning of the storm, the air had a particular weight to it, a stillness that Ethan recognized, and Clara had learned to recognize from watching him. Something's coming, he said at breakfast. How bad? He looked at the window. Can't say yet. Could be nothing. Could be the kind of storm that takes fences. They spent the morning reinforcing what could be reinforced, checking the gate latches, pulling the most vulnerable equipment under cover. By noon, the sky was the color of old pewter and the wind had shifted. By 2 in the afternoon, the first wall of weather hit the property like something that had been running hard for a long distance and arrived with everything it had left. The rain came sideways. The wind drove it under doors and through the small gaps in the barn wall where the boards had shrunk over years of Montana winters. Lightning cracked the sky over the eastern hills. Clara was in the barn with Ethan when they heard it. A deep rolling crash from the direction of the south pasture, followed immediately by the sound that every rancher dreads, which is the particular rattling absence of a fence that has been there and is no longer. Ethan was moving before the echo died. Stay here, he said. Absolutely not, she said. He did not argue. There was no time. The south fence. The section they had repaired first 4 weeks ago. The section Clara had driven into muddy ground and leveled and felt unreasonably proud of had not failed. The section adjacent to it, the old section they hadn't yet reached on the repair schedule, had. A full 30-foot run of it was down, posts pulled out of the ground by the force of the wind-driven cattle pressing against it when the lightning hit nearby and spooked the herd. In the rain and the failing light they counted. 11 cattle were through the gap, moving toward the upper pasture where the land went steep and rocky, and in good weather was manageable for cattle, and in a storm like this was not. Ethan's face in the rain was controlled in the way that a person's face is controlled when they are not allowing themselves to process the full weight of something yet. "I need to go after them," he said. "We go after them," she said. He looked at her. "I know where they'll move," she said. She had spent 6 weeks walking this land, mapping it in her head with the same methodical attention she gave everything. "They'll push upslope to get away from the noise. There's a natural hollow about a quarter-mile up where they'll bunch. If we come in from 2 sides. You've been up there 3 times, she said, learning the land. He looked at her for 1 second in the driving rain. Then, take the east approach. Come in slow, don't spook them further. I'll come in from the west. We push them back together. Understood. They split. What happened over the next 90 minutes was not heroic in the way that stories make things heroic. It was cold and wet and physically brutal. Clara's skirt was soaked through in the first 3 minutes, and she tucked it up and tied it, and moved through the dark and rain, using the landscape she had memorized on dry afternoons in good boots. And she was more afraid than she had been of almost anything in her adult life, and she moved anyway. She found the cattle where she said they'd be. She came in from the east side, slow and low, talking the whole time. Not words exactly, just sound, the consistent human presence that lets an animal know where you are and that you mean no harm. The cattle shifted. The outer ones turned. She kept moving, kept talking, and gradually by increments they began to move. Ethan appeared from the west side. He saw her. She saw him. In the dark and the rain, with 11 cattle between them and a broken fence at the bottom of the hill, something passed between them that was not words and did not need to be. They worked the cattle back. It took the full 90 minutes. At one point, a young heifer broke left, and Clara cut her off on foot, moving faster than she had any right to move in those conditions, getting between the animal and the rocky slope, holding her ground until the heifer turned. When the last animal was back through the temporary gap Ethan had rigged, and the makeshift repair was up, not solid, not the work of a careful afternoon, but up. They stood on either side of the fence in the rain and looked at each other. Ethan was breathing hard. So was she. "The heifer," he said. "You cut her off. She was heading for the rocks. That was—" He stopped. "That was something." "It worked," she said. "Clara." He said her name the way he had said it the night after Whitfield left, with a weight in it that hadn't been there at the beginning. "Are you hurt?" "I'm wet," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her for a long moment in the rain. "Come on," he said. "Let's get inside." She found out about what happened in town the next morning. Ethan had ridden in early to report the fence damage and the storm's toll to the insurance man, a standard procedure for events of this kind. He was back by noon, and when he came through the kitchen door, his jaw was set in a line. She recognized the line that meant something had happened, that he was deciding how to tell her. She put down what she was doing. "What?" she said. He sat down at the table, set his hat on the surface. "Pierce was at the bank this morning when I arrived." She waited. "He'd already spoken to the bank manager," Ethan said. "Before I got there. He told them the storm had compromised the property, that cattle were lost, that the Whitfield agreement was—" He stopped. He said it was informal and wouldn't hold. "The Whitfield agreement is in writing," she said. "We both signed it. I know that. I showed them. But Pierce had been there for an hour before me, Clara. He'd already planted the idea that the ranch was in worse shape after the storm than before, that the bank should move on the note before October rather than wait. Can they do that? Legally, they'd have to find cause, But if Pierce is on the bank board, he looked at her. He's been on the board for 12 years. The full shape of it landed. Pierce had not been discouraged by the Whitfield visit. He had adjusted. He had waited for the storm, and then he had moved fast, and he had gone directly to the instrument with the most power over the ranch's survival and worked it before Ethan could counter. It was a smart move. She did not want to respect it, but she did. "What did the bank manager say?" she said. "That he'd need to review the situation, that he'd be in touch within the week, which means Pierce has a week to work on him further." "Yes." Clara sat down across from him. She put both hands flat on the table and breathed. Ethan watched her. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. "I'm thinking," she said carefully, "that Pierce has made a mistake." "What mistake?" "He went after the banknote, which means he's working from the assumption that the land is the leverage." She looked at Ethan. "But the land isn't the leverage anymore. The Whitfield agreement is the leverage. A signed breeding partnership with documented bloodlines is worth more than the note Pierce is trying to call. If Whitfield confirms the agreement's value directly to the bank..." She stopped. "Do you have Whitfield's contact information?" "He left a card. Write to him today, tonight. Explain the situation. Ask if he'd be willing to send a letter confirming the financial value of the partnership to the bank manager by end of week." She paused. "He said the records were exceptional. Men like Whitfield don't say that unless they mean it. If he means it, he'll back it up." Ethan looked at her. "You think he'll do it?" "I think he drove 4 hours from Helena because he believed in what your father built," she said. "Yes, I think he'll do it." A silence. Ethan turned his hat over in his hands. Once. Twice. "I've been running this ranch alone for 4 years," he said. "And in 4 months, we've been running it," she said. He looked up. "We," she said again, firmly without apology. Something crossed his face that she couldn't name. Too complex for the almost smile. Too warm for the careful wariness. Something that was both at once, and neither the expression of a man standing at the edge of something he has been approaching for a long time, and has only just realized how close he is. "Write to Whitfield," she said. He stood, picked up his hat. "Clara." He paused at the doorway, looked back at her. "After this is settled, the bank Pierce, all of it, I want to talk to you. About something that isn't the ranch." Her heart did something complicated. "All right," she said. He nodded once, went to find paper and pen. What neither of them knew was that Pierce was not finished. He had lost the first round at the bank. He had lost the second round when Whitfield's letter arrived on Friday, brief, formal, absolutely unambiguous about the financial value of the breeding partnership, and the bank manager sent a note confirming that no action would be taken on the note before October. Pierce received that information on a Saturday morning. By Saturday afternoon, he had moved to a different instrument entirely. The instrument was Virginia Marsh. Clara found out the way she found out most things that happened in Willow Creek through Tom Pearson's hired man at the feed store, who was, as she had noted early on, friendly and talkative. The information came out sideways the way gossip does, when the person sharing it isn't entirely sure they should be sharing it. What Tom's hired man told her in pieces and around the edges was this. Virginia Marsh had been to see Harold Pierce at his office on Friday evening. After that visit, Virginia had gone directly to Reverend Cole's wife Alma and had told her something that was now moving through Willow Creek with the speed of things that are designed to move quickly. What Virginia had said apparently was that the arrangement at the Callahan ranch was inappropriate. That a single woman living alone with a single man, however the work was described, was a scandal. That she had spoken to Mr. Pierce, who was, of course, a concerned member of the community, and he shared her worry. That something ought to be done for Ethan's sake, before his reputation suffered any further. Clara stood in the feed store and received this information with a stillness so complete that Tom's hired man, who was watching her face, actually leaned back slightly. "I thought you should know, ma'am," he said. I don't think it's right what they're saying." "Thank you, Tom," she said. "I appreciate you telling me." She collected her supplies. She drove back to the ranch. She did not cry. She had not cried since she was 19 years old and had cried long enough and hard enough to last her the rest of her life, and had decided afterward that it was not a useful expenditure of herself when there was work to do. But she sat in the wagon on the Cottonwood Road for a moment before she turned in at the gate. Just a moment, just enough to acknowledge to herself that this one hurt. Not because it surprised her. Nothing about the machinery of social cruelty surprised her at this point in her life, but because she had begun for the first time in years to feel like she was somewhere she was allowed to be. And now someone was trying to take that from her too. She turned in at the gate. She went inside. She put away the supplies. She was in the kitchen when Ethan came in from the pasture and she told him. He stood in the kitchen doorway and listened without interrupting. His expression changed twice, first to something she could only call cold, a particular quality of stillness that was not calm but its opposite, the stillness of a thing under pressure, and then to something else. Something that moved through the cold and came out the other side. When she finished, he said, "Virginia went to Pierce." "Yes. And Pierce is using her to move the fight from the bank to the community," she said. "Yes, it's a different kind of leverage." "He's trying to make me choose," Ethan said, "between the ranch and—" He stopped. The sentence sat in the kitchen between them unfinished. Clara looked at him. She kept her voice level and her face still, and she said the hardest thing she had said in years. "Ethan, if you need me to leave, if it's better for you, for the ranch, for everything you've built, you can tell me. I will understand it." The silence that followed was the longest of the 4 months she had been on this ranch. Ethan looked at her. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and he stopped in front of her close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to hold his eyes, and his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. Every careful layer stripped back, nothing held in reserve. "I'm going to town," he said, "tomorrow morning, and I'm going to say something in front of people who need to hear it." "Ethan, I'm going to tell them that you work this ranch with me," he said, "that you have done more for this property in 4 months than I managed in 4 years alone. That any person who speaks about you without respect is someone I have no interest in knowing." His voice was low and controlled and absolutely certain. "And I'm going to say that the arrangement on this ranch is a working partnership, and if that isn't sufficient for the sensibilities of Harold Pierce or Virginia Marsh or the entire Willow Creek Ladies Auxiliary, they can take that complaint and—" He stopped, breathed. "They can mind their own business." Clara stared at him. Her chest was doing something she could not entirely manage. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know I don't have to," he said. "That's not why I'm doing it." "Then why?" He looked at her. All the careful layers down, all the distance he had maintained, that she had respected, that they had both kept by mutual unspoken agreement, because neither of them was ready for what it would mean to close it, all of it gone. "Because you're not the woman who needs to prove herself to this town," he said. "You've already proven it, to me, and that is the only opinion on this ranch that counts." The word "this" landed like an anchor. She could feel it, the weight and finality of it. She was not going to cry. She was not. But her throat did something uncooperative, and she had to press her lips together before she trusted them to form words. "Ethan," she said, "before you say anything in town, before you stand up in front of people and put yourself out there, you should know something." "What?" She looked at him, straight and steady, the way she looked at everything she was serious about. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Pierce can't move me. Virginia Marsh can't move me. The bank, the note, the storm, the gossip, none of it can move me. I am not leaving this ranch." A beat. "Unless you ask me to, and you just told me you're not going to." Something broke open in his face. Broke open and came through in a way that was too large and too real for an almost smile, a full, unguarded, astonished relief, the expression of a man who has been braced for a blow that did not come. "No," he said. "I'm not going to." "Then we're in agreement," she said. He reached out and took her hand. Both of his hands around hers, those careful, big, work-roughened hands that had held her bruised arm gently 6 weeks ago. He held her hand the same way now, like something worth protecting. "Tomorrow," he said. "Together." "Together," she said. The next morning they drove into Willow Creek side by side. Ethan did not make a speech. He was not a man for speeches. He did something more effective. He walked into the mercantile where Saturday morning brought half the town in for supplies, and he stood at the counter and he greeted people by name, something he had not done in years, something that by itself made people straighten and pay attention. And in the course of 3 or 4 conversations, he said clearly and without apology that Clara Whitmore was his partner in running the Callahan ranch, that the property was no longer at risk of foreclosure, and that anyone who had a question about Miss Whitmore's role or her character could ask him directly. Nobody asked. Harold Pierce was not in the mercantile that morning. Virginia Marsh was. She stood near the dry goods shelf and held herself very still and did not look at either of them. Alma Cole, the Reverend's wife, came over to Clara and said, "It's nice to see the ranch looking so well. Tom Pearson's man says the new fence line on the South Road is the best work he's seen in the territory." "Thank you," Clara said. "Tom's man also says you outran a heifer in a rainstorm," Alma added, and the corner of her mouth moved. "I was motivated," Clara said. Alma Cole laughed. It was the first time anyone in Willow Creek besides Ethan had laughed with Clara rather than at her. Clara felt it settle somewhere warm. On the way home with the wagon loaded and the town behind them and the cottonwood road ahead, Ethan said, "Alma Cole is a good woman." "She is," Clara said. A silence. A good silence. The comfortable kind. "You said you weren't going anywhere," he said. "I'm not." Another silence. The cottonwoods moved above the road. "That conversation I mentioned," he said. "The one that isn't about the ranch." Her hands tightened slightly in her lap. "I haven't forgotten," she said. He was quiet for another moment. Then, "I've been alone a long time, Clara. Not just since my father died. Before that too, in ways that are harder to explain. I know what it's like," she said. "To be alone inside a life that looks like it has people in it." He turned to look at her. The wagon rolled on. "I didn't expect you," he said. "When you stepped off that coach, I thought I needed someone who could manage the house and not make things harder than they already were." "That's reasonable," she said. "It was wrong," he said. She looked at him. "What you are," he said, "is the reason I still have a ranch to worry about, and the reason I care about it again, and the reason—" He stopped, looked at the road. "The reason I've started thinking past October." Clara sat with those words. Thinking past October. Past the banknote. Past the crisis. Into a future with a shape. Into a future with someone in it. "What do you see?" she asked. "Past October." He was quiet for a long moment. "You," he said. One word. The same economy as everything else. No performance, no decorating it, no fencing it around with qualifications. Just the simple and complete truth of a man who had stripped himself of everything unnecessary. The cottonwoods moved above them. The wagon rolled on. Clara looked at the road ahead. "All right," she said. 2 words, his, both of them going home. The letter from the bank arrived on a Wednesday. Clara was at the kitchen table working through the fall supply calculations when she heard Ethan's boots on the porch, not his usual pace, which was unhurried and deliberate, but something faster. She looked up before he came through this door. He was holding an envelope. She set down her pencil. He crossed the kitchen and put the letter on the table in front of her without speaking. She picked it up. Read it. The bank manager, a man named Gerald Foss, who she had never met, and who had apparently spent the last 3 weeks being worked on from 2 directions, simultaneously had made his decision. The note would not be called early. The Whitfield agreement had been reviewed and accepted as sufficient evidence of the ranch's improved financial position. The original October deadline stood, and given the documented improvement in the property's condition and income prospects, the bank was prepared to discuss refinancing terms at a lower interest rate. At the bottom, in careful, formal language that was clearly not Gerald Foss's own phrasing, too precise, too legally shaped, was a sentence that told Clara everything about who had actually written this part of the letter. It stated that the bank wished to acknowledge that the management improvements at the Callahan property had been substantial and that the institution looked forward to a continued productive relationship. Pierce had not written that sentence. Pierce would never have written that sentence. Someone had made him include it. "Alma Cole's husband sits on the bank board," Ethan said. She looked up. "Reverend Cole," he said. "He's been a board member for 8 years. I didn't know that until yesterday. Apparently—" A pause. "Apparently he and Alma had a conversation last week." Clara thought of Alma Cole in the Mercantile. The quiet woman with the dry humor and the careful eyes. The woman who had laughed with her, not at her. The woman who had said the very first week Clara arrived that the details of her figure were not particularly anyone's concern. "I underestimated her," Clara said. "So did Pierce," Ethan said. She set the letter down, breathed, pressed both palms flat on the table in the way she did when something large needed to be held still until she could process it properly. "It's over," she said. "The bank part is over," he said. "Pierce won't stop." "No," he agreed. "But he's out of instruments." He sat down across from her. "The bank is settled. The Whitfield partnership is signed. The town—" He paused. "The town is starting to see what I see." She looked at him. "What do you see?" she said. He met her eyes. "A woman who saved my ranch," he said, "and who I don't intend to let go." The words landed clean and direct the way everything he said landed. No flourish, no performance. Just the truth stated plainly left on the table for her to do with as she chose. Clara held it for a moment. Then she said, "You mentioned a conversation, one that isn't about the ranch." "I did. We've been putting it off." "We have." He looked at her. "I think we've both been—" "Careful," she said. "Careful," he agreed. "I'm done being careful." Her heart made a decision that the rest of her caught up to 3 seconds later. "So am I," she said. But before that conversation could find its full shape, Pierce made his final move. It came 3 days after the bank letter, which told Clara something about the man he had waited long enough to confirm that his board influence had failed, and then he had reached for the only thing he had left. What he had left was not leverage. It was spectacle. He called a town meeting, not officially. Willow Creek had no formal mechanism for town meetings, no mayor, no civic hall. But Pierce had been here long enough and was connected enough that when he let it be known, he wanted people to gather at the feed store on a Friday evening to discuss community concerns regarding certain properties in the territory. People came, not all of them, not the better ones, but enough. Clara found out from Tom's hired man again on Friday afternoon. She went home and told Ethan. He stood very still. "He's going to argue the morality angle," Ethan said. "Since the bank failed." "He's going to argue whatever will work," Clara said. "He wants the land, Ethan. He's always wanted the land. The method changes. The goal doesn't." "I should go." "We should go," she said. He looked at her. "Clara, I am not hiding in this house while a man talks about me to a room full of people," she said, quietly. "Absolutely. I have not hidden from anything in my life, and I am not starting now." A silence. "No," he said. "You haven't." They drove into town as the sun was going down. The feed store was fuller than she had expected. 30 people, maybe more, arranged in the informal way of people who are pretending they haven't come for a specific purpose. Pierce stood near the front counter with his hat in his hands and the practiced expression of a man who is performing concern rather than experiencing it. When Ethan and Clara walked through the door, the room shifted. Not loudly. Just the subtle physical adjustment of people recalibrating their understanding of what kind of evening this was going to be. Virginia Marsh was there. She looked at Clara and then immediately looked away. Margaret Hale was there with 2 women Clara recognized from the ladies' auxiliary. Alma Cole was there standing near the back wall, and when Clara's eyes found hers, Alma gave her a small, composed nod. Reverend Cole was there too. Pierce looked at Ethan, then at Clara. Something moved behind his eyes, surprise quickly managed. "Callahan," he said pleasantly. "Glad you came. This concerns you directly." "I know it does," Ethan said. He did not move further into the room. He stood just inside the door with Clara beside him, and he looked at Pierce with the particular quality of attention that a man gives something he has decided is a problem he's going to solve tonight. Well, Pierce looked around the room with the benevolent confidence of a man who has prepared his ground carefully. As I was about to say to everyone, there are people in this community who are concerned about the situation out at the Callahan Ranch, the nature of the arrangement, whether it sets the right example for Mr. Pierce. Ethan's voice was not loud. It was the opposite of loud, controlled and low, and carrying the full weight of a man who does not raise his voice because he does not need to. The room went quiet. Say what you're actually trying to say. Pierce paused. The pleasantness stayed in place but required more effort. I'm simply expressing what several concerned citizens. You're trying to damage Miss Whitmore's reputation, Ethan said. Because the bank failed, and the Whitfield partnership failed, and you have run out of legitimate ways to get what you want. He looked around the room as he said it, not performing it, just making sure it was heard by everyone who needed to hear it. So now you're going to use gossip, like a man who's out of cards playing with a borrowed deck. The silence in the feed store was the particular silence of 30 people trying very hard not to react visibly. Pierce's pleasant expression thinned. Callahan, I'm trying to protect... You're trying to protect your investment, Ethan said, which is not on my land, whatever you believe. The community has legitimate concerns. I'll tell you what the community has. Ethan stepped forward. One step enough to close the distance between them from a comfortable social range to something that required Pierce to hold his ground or step back. Pierce held his ground, but it cost him something. The community has a ranch that was failing 3 years ago and is not failing now. A signed breeding partnership with a Helena cattle company that has put money back into this territory. Fences that are straight and cattle that are healthy, and a note that the bank has agreed to refinance at better terms. He paused. And Miss Whitmore is the reason for most of that. He turned then. Not away from Pierce, that was important. Clara understood it immediately, but toward her. He turned toward her in a room full of people who had laughed at her on her first day, who had whispered and pointed and said she wasn't worth the space she occupied. And he looked at her, the way he looked at things he had decided were valuable and worth protecting. Clara Whitmore came to this ranch 4 months ago, he said. To the room. To all of them. She came with 1 suitcase and $32 and more sense and capability than anyone in this room gave her credit for. She has worked this land alongside me every day since. She has saved what my father built, and she is my partner. A pause. The word landed like a nail driven clean. In every sense of the word that matters. The room was completely still. Pierce opened his mouth. Reverend Cole spoke first. The Reverend was a quiet man by nature, the kind of man whose authority came from consistency rather than volume. And when he spoke, people listened the way they listened to things said in low, certain voices. I think, the Reverend said, that this community owes Miss Whitmore an apology. Several by my count. He looked at Pierce. And I think that certain ambitions regarding private property in this territory would be better directed elsewhere. Pierce looked at the Reverend, looked at the room, looked at Ethan, looked finally at Clara. She looked back at him, straight, still. She did not give him the satisfaction of an expression that told him anything about what she was feeling. He put his hat on. Good evening, he said. He walked out of the feed store. The door closed behind him. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, Margaret Hale. Margaret Hale, who had made the first cruel comment on the day Clara arrived, who had told the story to every woman in Willow Creek, who had helped build the current of judgment that had followed Clara for 4 months, cleared her throat. Well, she said stiffly, I suppose the ranch has come along nicely. It was not an apology. It was not close to an apology. But in the economy of small-town social currency, it was the closest Margaret Hale was capable of coming, and Clara understood that. It has, Clara said. Alma Cole moved through the thinning crowd and took Clara's hand in both of hers. Well done, she said simply. The Reverend did the work tonight, Clara said. The Reverend said what needed saying, Alma replied. You gave him 4 months of reasons to say it. They drove home in the dark. The Montana sky above them was enormous and salted with stars, the kind of sky that made you feel both very small and strangely significant, and they did not talk for most of the road because there was nothing that needed talking yet. The horses found the way home as horses do, and the wagon rolled on. And beside her, Clara could feel the warmth of Ethan's arm close to hers on the narrow seat. "Halfway down the Cottonwood Road," he said. "You didn't say anything. In there." "You said it," she said. "It needed to come from me." "I know," she said. "That's why I let you." A pause. Most people would have wanted to speak for themselves. "I speak for myself all the time," she said. "I know the difference between a situation that needs my voice and one that needs yours. Tonight needed yours." He was quiet for a moment. "Partner," he said. "Not a question." "You said it to a room full of people," she said. "I meant it to a room full of people." She looked at the road, the stars, the dark line of cottonwoods. "Ethan," she said. "That conversation." "Yes," he said. "I think we've been having it," she said. "For 4 months, a little bit at a time." He turned to look at her. In the starlight, his face was all shadow and the pale gleam of his eyes. "I think you're right," he said. "So." She breathed. "Say the rest of it." He pulled the wagon to a stop. Right there in the middle of the Cottonwood Road, a quarter mile from home. He stopped the horses and turned on the seat to face her fully, and he said, "I am in love with you, Clara Whitmore." No preamble, no careful approach. The same economy as always, the stripped-down, undecorated truth offered with both hands. She sat with it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, "I know." He blinked. "I've known for about 6 weeks," she said. "I was waiting for you to catch up." Something crossed his face, surprise, then amusement, then something deeper than either, and then he laughed. A real laugh, unguarded, the laugh of a man who hasn't laughed like that in a very long time, and the sound of it out there on the dark road under the Montana stars was one of the most beautiful things Clara had heard in her life. 6 weeks, he said. "You're observant about cattle," she said. "Less so about yourself." "Clara." "Yes." He reached over and tucked a loose strand of her hair back from her face carefully, the way he did everything that mattered, and his hand rested for a moment against her cheek. "I love you," he said again. "In case once wasn't enough." "Once was enough," she said. "But I don't mind hearing it again." He leaned forward and kissed her. Gently, seriously. The way a man kisses a woman when he is not practicing and not performing, and has no audience and no agenda. Just the plain, earnest, enormous fact of meaning it. When he pulled back, she was smiling in a way she couldn't have prevented if she'd tried. "Drive us home," she said. He picked up the reins. October arrived. The note came due on the 14th. Ethan rode to the bank on the morning of the 13th. Not because he was worried, because he wasn't, but because he was the kind of man who settled his accounts a day early rather than a day late. Clara did not go with him this time. This was the way. The room at the feed store had been his. There were things that needed to belong to him alone, and she understood the difference. He was back by noon. He came into the kitchen, and she looked at his face, and she knew before he said a word. "Done," he said. She nodded. "Gerald Foss shook my hand," he said. "He also asked whether I'd be interested in sitting on the Agricultural Advisory Committee for the territory." She looked up. "Did he?" "I said I'd think about it." He set his hat on the table, sat down. He also said, a pause, a slight change in his expression. He said that whatever I was doing differently out at the ranch, I should keep doing it. Clara put the coffee on the stove. "Smart man," she said. "I told him I would." He watched her move around the kitchen. "Clara." "I want to ask you something." Something in his voice made her still. She turned. Howe was sitting at this table with his hands folded in front of him and his eyes on her, and his expression was the most open she had ever seen. It more open than the night on the Cottonwood Road, more open than the night he said the words. Because those moments had been the arrival of something he had been approaching. This was something new. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not as a partner in the business sense. Not as I want you to stay as my wife Clara. If you'll have me." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the Montana fall moved through the cottonwoods in long, dry whispers. Clara looked at this man. This quiet, stubborn, good man who had stood in a room full of people and said her name like it mattered, who had laughed on a dark road, like someone who had remembered who made coffee badly every morning and checked on every animal before he went to sleep, and had hands that could hold broken things gently. She thought of the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach 4 months ago carrying one suitcase and $32, and the certain knowledge that the world had already made its judgment about what she was worth. She thought of what it meant that she was still here, that she had built this, that it was hers. "Yes," she said. "Ethan, yes." He stood up so fast, the chair scraped back, and he crossed the kitchen in 2 steps, and when he took her face in both of those careful, work-roughened hands and kissed her. This time it was not the gentle, serious kiss on the dark road. It was something larger than that. Something that contained 4 months of mornings before dawn, and fence posts driven in the rain, and breeding ledgers spread across a kitchen table, and a woman who had outrun a heifer in a storm, and a man who had stood in front of his whole town and said partner like it was the most natural word in the world. When they broke apart, Clara was laughing. She hadn't expected to be laughing, but she was. "Your coffee is burning," she said. He turned around. It was. He pulled it off the stove and he was smiling fully openly. The smile she had only seen in pieces before now. And the kitchen smelled like burnt coffee, and morning, and something new beginning. They told no one for 3 days. It was not a secret exactly, more like something they wanted to hold between them without the weight of the outside world on it yet. The ranch continued. The work continued. But there was something different in the ordinary rhythm of it, now something that had always been building toward this and had finally arrived. On the 4th day, Alma Cole came by the ranch. She came with a basket of preserves and the transparent pretense of returning a pie tin she'd borrowed the previous month, which Clara had not lent her, and both of them understood was not the point. They sat in the kitchen while Ethan was in the pasture, and Alma looked at Clara over her coffee cup with those careful, perceptive eyes. "Something's different," Alma said. Clara looked at her, then helplessly smiled. Alma's face transformed. Not surprised. Clara suspected very little surprised Alma Cole, but warm, genuinely deeply warm. "Well," Alma said, "it's about time." 4 months, Clara said. For a man like Ethan Callahan, 4 months is practically impetuous. She set down her cup, reached across the table and put her hand over Clara's. "You are exactly what this ranch needed. What he needed." A pause. "And I think you found what you needed too." Clara thought about $32 and a burned letter, and a woman who had told herself for years that needing things was a weakness she couldn't afford. "Yes," she said, "I did." Ethan came in from the pasture while Alma was still there. He looked at the 2 women, looked at Clara's face, looked at Alma. "She knows," Clara said. "I figured," he said. He nodded at Alma with the grave formality he used for things he felt strongly about. "Thank you for what your husband did, at the bank and at the meeting." "Thomas did what was right," Alma said simply. "That's what he does." "So did you," Ethan said, "from the beginning." Alma stood, picked up her basket. "I'll let you get on with things." At the door she paused and looked back at them, at Ethan standing in his kitchen doorway, and Clara at the table, the ordinary geometry of 2 people who have made a life in the same space. "You should have the wedding before the snow," she said. "Montana doesn't give you much window." She left. Ethan looked at Clara. "She's not wrong," he said. "She's never wrong," Clara said. "It's a little unsettling." He crossed the kitchen, put his hand on the back of her chair, leaned down so his face was level with hers. "Before the snow," he said. "Before the snow," she agreed. He kissed her forehead, went to pour himself coffee, made a face at the cup when he tasted it. "You burned it," he said. "You distracted me," she said. "Fair," he said, and started a new pot. 2 weeks later, Pierce left Willow Creek. It was not announced. He did not hold a gathering. He simply was there on a Monday and was not there on a Tuesday. His house closed up his office sign, taken down his horse and wagon, gone from the livery. Within a week, the story had fully assembled itself in the way that town stories do. He had overextended financially on several property bets that had not come through, and he had creditors and billings he could no longer avoid facing. The land he had wanted was still there, still in Ethan Callahan's name, still being worked. Clara heard the news from Tom's hired man on a supply run and drove home and told Ethan over supper. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I don't take any satisfaction in a man's failure." "I know," she said, "but I won't pretend this doesn't simplify things." "No," she said, "I won't pretend either." He looked at her across the table, the lamp between them. The ledgers, stacked on the shelf behind her, organized now, documented the record of everything this ranch had been and what it was becoming. "My father would have run that man off the property the first time he came around with his soft hands and his banker's smile," Ethan said. "Your father didn't have the breeding records working for him," Clara said. "He didn't know their value." "You knew." "I read carefully," she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Just that. His hand over hers, warm and solid and there. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said. She turned her hand over and held his. Outside the Montana. October moved through the cottonwoods. The cattle were healthy, and the fences were straight, and the barn doors hung level on their new hinges. The breeding ledgers were organized and documented, and had already drawn 2 more letters of inquiry from ranchers in Helena who had heard about the Whitfield partnership. The ranch was alive. More than alive. It was beginning. And the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach with a broken suitcase and $32 and the certain knowledge that the world had already decided what she was worth, had built something that the world was going to have to revise its opinion about. She had always known it was possible. She had just needed one man willing to let her prove it. And on the Callahan Ranch in the long golden fall of 1884, surrounded by straight fences and healthy cattle, and a man who had said her name in front of his whole town like it was the most important word in his vocabulary. Clara Whitmore had finally irrevocably come home. The wedding happened on a Saturday in late October, 11 days before the first snow. Reverend Cole performed the ceremony in the small white church at the edge of Willow Creek, and the church was fuller than either of them had expected or planned for. Alma Cole had apparently mentioned the date to a small number of people, and those people had mentioned it to a small number of others, and by the morning of the wedding, there were close to 60 people in a church built for 40. Clara wore her best dress, not the blue prairie dress, which had given 4 months of hard service and deserved its retirement, but a dark green wool she had ordered from the dry goods store 3 weeks prior, and altered herself by lamplight in the evenings. It fit her well. She had not altered it to disguise anything. She had altered it to fit the body she had, which was the body that had driven posts in the rain and outrun a heifer in a storm, and bent over breeding ledgers until midnight, and she saw no reason to apologize for any of it. Ethan was waiting at the front of the church in a clean dark coat she had never seen before. He had his hat off naturally. His dark hair was combed. When she came through the door and he turned and saw her, something happened to his face that made Alma Cole, watching from the second pew, press her handkerchief to her mouth. He looked at Clara the way a man looks at something he was afraid he would never have. She walked toward him, and he held out his hand, and she took it, and his grip was steady and warm and certain. Reverend Cole said the words. They said theirs. When it was done, Ethan leaned down and kissed her, and the church made a sound that was partly applause and partly the collective exhale of 60 people who had been holding their breath. Tom's hired man, whose name Clara had finally learned was Will, let out a whoop from the back that made everyone laugh, including Reverend Cole. Outside afterward, in the cold, bright October air, Margaret Hale approached Clara. Clara had not expected this. She had not expected Margaret to come at all, and she had expected even less what happened next. Margaret Hale looked at her with the expression of a woman who has spent a long time being wrong about something, and is finding the admission difficult, but is making herself do it anyway. Miss Whitmore, she said, then corrected Mrs. Callahan. A pause. The ranch has come along beautifully. I heard about the Whitfield partnership. My husband says it's the most significant breeding agreement in the territory this year. It is, Clara said. Another pause. Margaret's chin lifted slightly and then came down. I was unkind, she said. When you arrived, I said things I had no basis for saying. Clara looked at her. This woman who had been the first voice of the chorus that had followed her from the stagecoach step. Who had told the story to everyone who would listen. Who had used her like a punchline for months. She could have said a number of things. She said, I know you were. Thank you for saying so. It was not forgiveness exactly. It was something more practical than forgiveness. The acknowledgement that a thing had happened and had been acknowledged and could now be set down. Clara had no energy to carry grudges. She had a ranch to run. Margaret nodded, moved away. Her back was straighter than it had been when she came over, which told Clara something about what the apology had cost and what it had returned. Ethan appeared at Clara's shoulder. Margaret Hale just apologized to me, Clara said. I saw, he said. Your town surprises me sometimes. Our town, he said. She looked at him. Our town, she said, and meant it. The first snow came 11 days later and stayed. Montana winter was not a metaphor. It was a physical fact that required preparation and respect, and the willingness to work in conditions that would have broken a person with less conviction. Clara had prepared for it methodically through October. The wood supply, the feed stores, the insulation on the barn, the storm shutters on the windows. She had made Ethan order from Billings in September when he said they could probably wait another year. We're not waiting another year, she had told him. They had not waited another year. The shutters went up in the first week of November, 3 days before the storm that would have made installing them considerably less pleasant. Ethan came inside after the last one was secured, shaking snow off his coat, and looked at his wife at the kitchen stove. You were right about the shutters, he said. I know, she said. You don't have to look so satisfied. I'm not satisfied, she said. I'm warm. There's a difference. He hung up his coat, came to the stove, and stood close to it, close to her, and she handed him a cup of coffee without turning around, just reached back and found his hand and put the cup in it. The particular physical shorthand of people who have learned each other's rhythms. He drank it. Made no face about it this time. She had been teaching him to make it properly slowly through patient repetition. Whitfield's letter came, he said. She turned. He took the letter from his shirt pocket and handed it to her. She read it. James Whitfield wanted to accelerate the partnership timeline. He had shown the breeding documentation to 3 other Helena ranchers, all of whom were interested in purchasing breeding rights for the following spring. He was proposing a formal consortium arrangement, the Callahan bloodline, as the foundation shared documentation, multiple revenue streams. He had attached a preliminary figure for Clara's consideration. Clara read the figure twice. She set the letter down. Ethan, she said. I know, he said. This is, I know. She looked at him. He was watching her with that expression, the open, unguarded one, that she still was not entirely used to, the one that said he had nothing to protect from her. Your father, she said. He had no idea what he built. He built it for me, Ethan said. He just didn't know you'd be the one who'd see it. She picked up the letter again, read the figure again. Not because she didn't believe it the first time, but because some things need to be read twice before they fully become real. I want to write back today, she said. I thought you would, he said. And I want to propose a modification to the consortium structure. He raised his eyebrows. The documentation, she said. If we're the foundation of the consortium, we should retain editorial control of the breeding records. No other operation adds to the archive without our verification. She was already moving to the table, already reaching for paper and pencil. Whitfield will agree. He's a man who respects systems. Ethan watched her settle at the table and begin writing, her chestnut hair loose at the back of her neck. Her green wool sleeve pushed up at the wrist. Her face settling into the particular focused expression she wore when she was working on something that mattered. He sat down across from her. He did not have anywhere else to be. He did not want to be anywhere else. "Clara," he said. Still writing. "I love you," he said. She looked up. The focused expression softened at the edges. "I know," she said. "I love you too." She went back to the letter. "Don't distract me. I'm negotiating." He laughed. The Montana winter pressed against the shuttered windows, and the stove put out its steady heat, and Clara Whitmore Callahan wrote the letter that would change the shape of the next decade of their lives. Spring came, and with it, the first visitors. Not passing strangers. Not supply men or feed store customers. Ranchers from Helena, from Billings, from as far as Cheyenne, who had heard about the Callahan Breeding Consortium and wanted to see the operation with their own eyes before they committed their names and money to it. They came expecting a standard ranch. Some of them, Clara knew, were expecting something they could undervalue. What they found was something different. The first group arrived in March, 4 men in good coats with careful eyes, the same type as Whitfield, the kind of men who made decisions slowly and held them permanently once made. Ethan met them in the yard and shook hands and brought them inside, and Clara served coffee and put the documentation on the table, and the meeting lasted 4 hours. At the end of it, the man who had spoken leased a rancher from Cheyenne named Abbott, who had the most money and therefore the most reason to be cautious, looked at Clara directly and said, "You organized this documentation?" "Yes," she said. "Who trained you?" "Books," she said. "And paying attention." Abbott looked at her for a long moment. Not the recalibration look. She was past the age of recalibration look, she had decided, and apparently her manner communicated this because fewer people gave them to her now. This was a different look. Evaluative. Professional. "My operation in Cheyenne has a record-keeping problem," he said. 20 years of breeding data in a condition that is—" he paused diplomatically. "Incomplete." "I'm sorry to hear that," Clara said. "I'd pay well for someone who could organize it," he said. Ethan went very still across the table. Clara looked at Abbott, then at her husband, then back at Abbott. "Mr. Abbott," she said carefully, "what exactly are you proposing?" "A consulting arrangement," he said. "Not permanent relocation. A visit of 2 or 3 weeks, assess the records, develop a system, train someone to maintain it." He named a figure. "Plus travel." The figure was not insignificant. "I'll discuss it with my husband," Clara said. Abbott nodded, as if this was exactly the right answer, which told her he was a man who understood how functioning partnerships worked. After the men had gone, Ethan sat at the kitchen table and looked at his wife. "Cheyenne," he said. "It's 3 weeks," she said. "Maybe 4. "I know how long 3 weeks is," he said. "Ethan." She sat down across from him. "It's not just the money, though. The money isn't nothing. It's—" She stopped. "It's the work. The same work I did here that turned everything around. If I can do it for us, I can do it for others." "I know you can," he said. He did not say it doubtfully. He said it the way he said things he was certain of. "But," she said. He was quiet for a moment. 3 weeks is a long time," he said. "That's all." She looked at him. The man who had stood in a room full of people and said her name like it was worth saying. The man who had learned to make coffee because she'd taught him, who checked on every animal before he slept, who had laughed on a dark road in a way she would remember for the rest of her life. "I'll be back," she said. "You won't be able to get rid of me." "I know," he said. "I tried to get used to the idea from the beginning, and I was never able to manage it." She smiled. He reached across the table. She gave him her hand. "Go to Cheyenne," he said. "Do the work. Come home." "In that order," she said. "In that order," he agreed. She went to Cheyenne in April. The Abbott operation was larger than she'd expected, a genuine working ranch of serious scale with 20 years of breeding records in the condition Abbott had described, which was to say approximately the condition Ethan's had been in when she arrived, except multiplied by 5 and with less organizational foundation to build from. She worked 12 hours a day for 3 weeks. She organized, documented, cross-referenced, developed a tracking system she could teach, and spent the final 3 days teaching Abbott's foreman how to maintain it. The foreman was a quiet man named Davis, who reminded her somewhat of Ethan in the early weeks, not unfriendly, but deeply uncertain how to include another person's competence in his understanding of how things worked. By the end of the 3rd day, Davis had stopped being uncertain. "You've done this before," he said. It was not a question. "Once," she said, "with better raw material." "How so?" "The man who owned the records believed in them," she said, even when he'd forgotten why. Davis nodded slowly. "Mr. Abbott says you're the best thing that happened to the Callahan operation." "Mr. Abbott is generous," she said. "Mr. Abbott doesn't do generous," Davis said. "He does accurate." She thought about that on the ride home. Ethan met her wagon at the gate of the Cottonwood Road. She had not told him exactly when she'd arrived. The timing had been uncertain, dependent on the final train connection from Billings. He had been watching for her anyway. She could tell from the way he was standing at the gate, hat in hand, that he had been there for a while. She pulled the wagon to a stop. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You're thinner," she said. "I don't cook as well without supervision," he said. "I told you to have Will from the Pearson place come by." "I managed." "Ethan." "I managed," he said again. "Come home." She climbed down. He took her bag and she let him, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and she put her arm around his waist, and they walked up the Cottonwood Road toward the house without saying anything else, because there was nothing else that needed saying right at that moment. Inside, the kitchen was clean. The stove was warm. There was a pot of something on the back burner that smelled edible, which was better than she had feared. She lifted the lid, looked in. "Is this soup?" she said. "It's an attempt at soup," he said. "It smells like soup." "Progress," he said. She put the lid back, turned around. He was standing in the middle of the kitchen watching her with the expression that still, after months of seeing it, caught her somewhere in the chest every single time. "I missed you," he said. "I know," she said. "I missed you too." "How was Cheyenne?" "Productive," she said. "Abbott wants to refer me to 2 other operations." He was very still for a moment. "2 other operations," he said. "I told him I'd need to discuss it with my husband." The corner of his mouth moved. "Same husband as last time." "Only one I have," she said. He crossed the kitchen and put both arms around her, and she let herself lean into him. Something she did not do casually. She was not a person who leaned, and for a moment the kitchen was just the 2 of them, and the warm stove, and the sound of Montana outside the window. "Tell me about the referrals," he said into her hair. "Later," she said. "Feed me first. I've been on a train for 14 hours. The soup." "The soup is fine," she said. "Sit down. Tell me about the ranch." He sat. She sat across from him. He talked about the cattle, about a fence repair on the north line that Will had helped with, about a letter from Whitfield confirming the spring consortium arrangements, about a conversation with Reverend Cole, about the church needing a new roof, and whether the ranching community would contribute. She listened. She ate the soup, which was genuinely fine. She asked questions. She offered opinions when she had them. She told him about the Abbott operation, about Davis the foreman, about the system she had built. It was an ordinary evening, entirely ordinary. 2 people at a kitchen table talking about their work and their life, and the small and large things that comprised both. Clara Whitmore, who had arrived in Montana territory with a broken suitcase and no certainty that she would be wanted anywhere, looked at the man across the table from her and understood something she had not had words for until now. Home was not a place you were given. It was a place you built. And she had built this one herself, board by board, fence post by fence post, letter by letter, early morning by early morning, until it was solid enough to stand in any weather Montana could produce. The second winter came and went, and with it a change nobody on the ranch had planned for. Clara figured it out on a Tuesday in February, standing at the wash basin in the cold morning light. And she stood there for a long moment with the particular stillness of a person absorbing information that is going to alter the shape of everything. She told Ethan at breakfast. She set his coffee in front of him, sat down, looked at him. "I need to tell you something," she said. He put down his cup, looked at her face. Something moved through his expression, the quick, instinctive reading of her that he had developed over a year of paying close attention to her every mood. "Good something or hard something?" he said. "Both," she said. She told him. The silence that followed was 3 seconds long and contained an entire world. Then, Ethan Callahan, the quiet man who used words like currency and spent them only when certain of the return, pressed both hands flat on the kitchen table and breathed. "Clara," he said. "I know it changes things," she said. "The Cheyenne referral's the timeline for Clara." He stood up, came around the table, crouched down in front of her chair so he was looking up at her, a gesture so uncharacteristic of his usual physical economy that it stopped her mid-sentence. He took both her hands in his. "Stop planning for 10 seconds." She stopped. He looked at her. His eyes were the pale blue of overcast sky, and they were the most open she had ever seen them. Every layer down, nothing in reserve, the man entirely present. "Are you all right?" he said. "You. Not the ranch, not the timeline. You." She felt something give way in her chest. Not break, she was past breaking. But give way, the way a door gives way when someone finally uses the right key. "I'm all right," she said. And then, because it was true, and she was a woman who said true things, "I'm more than all right." He pressed his forehead to her hands for a moment. Just a moment. Then he looked up. "Good," he said. He stood, went back to his chair, picked up his coffee, set it down, picked it up again. "We'll need to write to Whitfield," he said. "The spring trip to Helena will need to adjust the timing." "I know," she said. "And the Cheyenne referrals we can probably defer one and—" "Ethan." He looked at her. "Stop planning for 10 seconds," she said. He stopped. A beat. He laughed. She laughed. Outside, the February wind moved through the cottonwoods, and inside the kitchen of the Callahan ranch in the long, bright morning of their second winter together, something new was beginning again. The spring of 1886 brought more visitors than any previous year. Word had traveled the way. Good things travel slowly at first, through the right channels, and then all at once. The Callahan Breeding Consortium had by this point formalized into a documented partnership between 6 ranching operations across 3 territories, with the Callahan bloodline records as the acknowledged foundation of the entire system. James Whitfield had taken to referring to Clara in his correspondence with other Helena businessmen as the most organized mind in the Montana cattle industry. He said it without qualification. He meant it without irony. 2 newspapermen came from Billings in April. One wrote for the Territorial Agricultural Journal. The other was doing a broader piece on ranching operations in the region. They came to the ranch expecting Clara suspected to speak primarily with Ethan. Ethan sat beside her at the kitchen table for both interviews and answered questions about the land, the animals, the physical operations of the ranch. When questions turned to the breeding program, the consortium structure, the documentation system, he said consistently and without hesitation, "That's Clara's work. You should ask her." They asked her. She answered. The Agricultural Journal piece ran 6 weeks later under the headline, "Callahan Ranch and the Science of Heritage Breeding: How One Montana Operation Built a Model for the Territory." The article mentioned Ethan's stewardship of his father's land and vision. It spent 3 paragraphs on Clara's documentation work and the consortium structure she had designed. Margaret Hale bought 3 copies. She did not explain why, and nobody asked. But Alma Cole caught Clara's eye in the Mercantile when the story came out, and the look they exchanged required no words. The second newspaper piece ran in the Billings Gazette, and was less technical, more human. The story of a ranch that had been failing and had been saved. It talked about the storm, the banknote, the breeding partnership. It talked about Ethan's father and the bloodlines he had spent 20 years developing. And near the end it said, "The woman at the center of the Callahan operations revival is not who you might expect." Clara Callahan arrived in Montana Territory 2 years ago as a stranger with no local history and no established reputation. What she brought instead was a quality rarer and more valuable then either the ability to see what others had overlooked and the conviction to act on it. Ethan read it at the breakfast table. Read it twice. Set it down. The ability to see what others had overlooked, he said. It's not wrong, Clara said. It's not complete, he said. She looked at him. It doesn't say that you also refused to leave when leaving would have been easier, he said, and that you were right about the shutters. She smiled. They can do a follow-up piece. He folded the newspaper. Stood. Came around the table and put his hand briefly on her shoulder, the particular gentle weight of it, the touch that had become as natural as breathing. Then he went to get his coat for the morning work. At the door he paused. Clara. Yes. The south fence, he said. The section we did first. It's still straight. She remembered that fence. Driving posts in mud and rain. The level she had used. The unreasonable pride she had felt when it was done. Of course it is, she said. I used a level. I know, he said. My father would have liked that too. He went out. She sat for a moment in the kitchen in the warmth of the stove, in the ordinary morning of her life. Later that year, when the leaves on the cottonwoods turned gold, and the air carried the first edge of another winter, a woman came to the Callahan ranch on a stage from Billings. She was young, maybe 23 or 24. She had a plain face and a sturdy build, and a suitcase that had seen better days, and she stood at the gate of the property with the particular expression of a person who has come a long way and is not entirely certain they have arrived at the right place. Clara was in the yard when the wagon came up the road. She watched the young woman climb down, watched her look at the ranch, at the straight fences, the repaired barn, the garden that was abundant even in October. Watched her take a breath and pick up her suitcase and walk toward the gate. Their eyes met. The young woman stopped. She had brown eyes, and she was clearly nervous, and she held her suitcase in both hands, the way you hold something you cannot afford to set down. I'm looking for Mrs. Callahan, she said. I read the advertisement about the assistant position for the record-keeping operation. Clara had placed that advertisement 3 weeks prior, when the consortium work had expanded past what one person could manage alone, and Ethan had said firmly that she was not adding another 12-hour day to her schedule without help. I'm Mrs. Callahan, Clara said. The young woman looked at her. The same brief recalibration, the same small internal adjustment. Clara recognized it from the inside, having experienced its mirror image 2 years ago on a stagecoach step in front of this same road. She let the young woman finish. She had learned that you had to let people finish it because there was no shortcut through it, and rushing it only made it last longer. Then she said, "Come inside. I'll make coffee, and you can tell me about your experience." "I don't have much experience," the young woman said. "Honest, at least." Honest was good. "What's your name?" Clara said. "Ruth," she said. "Ruth Harding." "Ruth." Clara opened the gate. "I didn't have much experience either when I arrived. What I had was the willingness to learn and the sense to pay attention." She held the gate. "Do you have those?" Ruth Harding looked at her with the expression of a person who has been told they don't have much and has been asked for more than they expected to be able to offer. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "I believe I do." Clara nodded. "Then come in," she said. "There's a great deal of work to do." She led the young woman up the path toward the house. The cottonwoods moved above them in the October wind, golden and steady and enormous. The ranch was alive around them, cattle in the pasture, smoke from the kitchen stove, the solid geometry of straight fences running to the horizon. Inside, Ethan was at the table with the latest consortium correspondence, which had grown to a weight of paper that required its own shelf. He looked up when they came in, looked at the young woman, looked at Clara. Clara said, "This is Ruth Harding. She's answered the advertisement." Ethan stood, extended his hand to Ruth, who shook it with the careful formality of someone trying very hard to make a good first impression. "Sit down, Miss Harding," he said. "My wife will tell you what the work involves. If she thinks you're capable, you are." He sat back down, returned to his correspondence. Ruth looked at Clara with eyes that were trying very hard to process what she had just witnessed. A man who had handed authority to his wife with the same matter-of-fact certainty with which he would state that the sky was blue. Clara had seen that look before too. She sat down across from Ruth and poured coffee and said, "Tell me why you came to Montana." Ruth told her. It was not a smooth story. It had rough edges and gaps, and the particular quality of a life that had been harder than it should have been for reasons that had nothing to do with the person living it. Clara listened the way she had learned to listen, without interrupting, without filling the silences, without offering judgment in any direction before the story was done. When Ruth finished, she looked at her hands. "I know I'm not what you probably expected," she said. "Nobody is," Clara said. "That's generally irrelevant." Ruth looked up. "What matters here," Clara said, "is the work. Whether you can learn it, do it, and keep doing it when it's harder than you expected." She held Ruth's eyes. "The ranch doesn't care about what you looked like when you arrived. It cares about what you do after." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Callahan," she said, "how long have you been here?" 2 years, Clara said. "And before that?" "Before that, I had a broken suitcase and $32 and a letter I'd memorized and burned," Clara said, "and the absolute conviction that I was not going to let anyone's opinion of me be the last word." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then something in her face settled. The nervousness did not disappear entirely. It was too soon for that, but beneath it, something steadied. The expression of a person who has heard something they were not sure existed and are now revising their understanding of what is possible. "I can learn," Ruth said. "I'm good at paying attention." "Then we'll get along fine," Clara said. She stood, went to the shelf, pulled down one of the breeding ledgers, and set it on the table in front of Ruth. "We'll start with the foundation records," she said. "Everything built from here." Ruth opened the ledger, looked at the careful 30-year-old handwriting, looked up at Clara. "Someone spent a long time on this," she said. "A whole life," Clara said. "And then someone else saw what it was worth." She sat back down. "That's usually how it works. The building and the seeing don't always belong to the same person. Your job is to figure out which one you are, and then do it as well as you can." Outside, the October light was gold and long. The cottonwoods moved. The cattle were in the pasture, and the fences were straight, and the barn doors hung level. Ethan at the other end of the table looked up briefly from his correspondence and met Clara's eyes, and then returned to his work without saying anything, because nothing needed to be said. This was the Callahan Ranch. This was what it had become. Not because the land had changed. The land was the same land it had always been, rolling and indifferent and enormous under the Montana sky. Not because the cattle had changed, or the seasons, or the brutal pragmatic reality of frontier life that required more from people than comfort or circumstance ever prepared them for. It had changed because a woman had arrived with a broken suitcase and refused to be what the world expected her to be. Because a man had been willing to listen to a voice the rest of the town had already decided wasn't worth hearing. Because 2 people had stood beside each other in the mud and the wind in the courtrooms of small-town opinion and had chosen every single day to keep choosing each other. That was all. That was everything. Clara Whitmore. Callahan looked at the young woman across the table, who was looking at an old ledger with the particular focused attention of someone who is beginning to understand that they are holding something important. She thought of herself 2 years ago, bending over these same pages. She thought of Ethan's father, who had spent 20 years building something he never knew the full value of. She thought of the south fence still straight. She thought of a dark road and a man's voice saying, "You," with the simplicity of a thing that has found its permanent home. She thought of $32 and a burned letter and a conviction that had turned out against every reasonable expectation to be correct. "All right, Ruth," she said. "Let's begin." And in the long gold light of the Montana afternoon on the ranch that had been lost and was now found in the life that had been built by a woman the world had underestimated, and a man who had been wise enough to stop the work that was never truly finished, continued. As it always does. As it always will. For the people willing to